My name is Rebecca Miller. I'm the Executive Director of the DC Preservation League. Some of you are new faces for us, so I just wanted to tell you a little bit about us. We were founded in 1971 to save the old post office building on Pennsylvania Avenue. Obviously, we are now 50 years later. The building has been saved and turned into a luxury hotel. We went on to save other buildings like the Willard Hotel, the Warner Theater, and thousands of other buildings across the city that are within historic districts and individual landmarks. We continue today with 4.5 staff members, and we focus on advocacy, education, and outreach programming. So our advocacy is to work on sound preservation legislation that comes through the council. We also testify before what's called the Historic Preservation Review Board that reviews major development projects in our city. And we also do a tremendous amount of research and documentation on not only neighborhoods, but individual landmarks across the city as well. We're currently working on some very important projects, such as the African American Civil Rights Multiple Property Document, which will allow for us to research and document additional sites important to African American civil rights across the city going forward and file landmark nominations for those. We're also completing a women's suffrage study. We're pursuing funding for a Black women's suffrage study as well, and a Latino heritage study as well. And then also the Asian American and Pacific Islander study that we're doing. So we're looking to really diversify the DC Inventory of Historic Sites and the National Register of Historic Places through these efforts. We do a lot of these free programming across the city. Obviously for the last 2 years, much of it has been online, so we're excited to be doing these in person again. And so welcome, and thank you for coming to the Martin Luther King Library. Just a little bit of history on this building, while we're waiting. So this building was built in 1972 and designed by a mid-century modern architect, Mies van der Rohe. And so this is the only library that Mies actually designed that was built. And one of the interesting things when you look at it from a street corner, you'll say, it seems a little squat, maybe, because it was actually designed to have an additional floor on it. So that's my kind of tidbits on this building. And so this building was actually one of DCPL's most endangered places since about 2003, when the city was actually considering demolition of this building. But through advocacy from this DCPL and a group of volunteers here, and also the Friends of the DC Public Library, and a very forward-thinking executive director for the DC Public Library system, we now have this state-of-the-art facility that a capital city should have for its residents. So let's see here. What are we?
Yeah. Oh, we're not. We almost.
Do you know how much longer he'll be?
He said he was in the garage, so it should be like no more than 5 minutes.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to introduce Gloria Reuben, who has been a friend of mine now for about a decade. She called me prior to the Lincoln film, Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, coming out, and said she was very interested in how we could preserve the legacy of Elizabeth Keckley here in Washington. And so we brainstormed some ideas, and one of the buildings where Elizabeth Keckley originally lived while she was designing clothes for Mary Todd Lincoln was up on 12th Street Northwest. The building still is there, except it's in a kind of different format. She's going to tell you her story. But so I'm going to turn it over to Gloria now, so she can. Sorry, I didn't want to steal your thunder. I apologize.
I want to tell that story.
Sorry, I'm just kidding. I'm done. I'll turn it over to Gloria. So enjoy Gloria right now.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you for your patience and for your sense of humor. Poor Rebecca. I'm giving her a sign like, I want to tell the story. It's such an awesome story. But really, Rebecca Miller, yes, indeed, just over a decade. Wait, where are we? 2022? Yeah, longer than a decade now, which is a little frightening. But thank you to you and everyone at the DC Preservation League and everyone at this beautiful library, and of course our friends at the White House Historical Association, and Jennifer Fleischner, terrific author. She's going to tell you about her amazing book. That was an extraordinary help for the research that I did, and we have a fun little tidbit to tell you about her book later. But thank you for, putting this program together. There are going to be great visuals and hopefully a couple of clips from the film that will be a part of this program. If you haven't seen it, if you haven't seen the film, you can actually leave right now because I think I'm pretty good at comedy apparently. Say it with a straight face, and you just never know what's going to happen. So Elizabeth Keckly. Yeah, Elizabeth Keckly. I remember very clearly, even though it was a long time ago, it would have been early 2011. And I got this audition for this film that Steven Spielberg was directing. Tony Kushner was writing the script. And it was, of course, for Lincoln. Daniel Day-Lewis was portraying Lincoln. And Steven wanted to see me audition for this role of Elizabeth Keckly. And I had literally a day and a half to read up about her. I mean, it's not really a surprise. Oftentimes auditions happen even in less amount of time. So clearly that wasn't enough time to read her autobiography, 30 Years a Slave or 4 Years in the White House. But thank goodness for Google, where I could at least do a little bit of research. Yeah, in such a short amount of time. First of all, the visual of her, there was something about the look in her face, the look in her eyes that just immediately caught me. And when I didn't want to inundate myself with too much information because then it just stays in my head. So, especially again with such a short amount of time, so I just kind of read the overview of her life and, how it affected me emotionally when I read about it, when I read about what happened to this woman, the trauma that she went to, her faith that she went through as a young girl, and throughout most of her life, actually, having been born into slavery, and her biological father was the master of the property, of course. He had slept with Elizabeth's mother, and she was given as a gift to one of the legitimate sons when she was a teenager, so she was a slave to her sibling. To being raped as a young woman and giving birth to a son named George. To creating her own business. She became very successful in her work as a seamstress, to buying her own freedom from her sister, buying her own freedom, her and her son's freedom, moving from St. Louis to Washington, D.C., opening up her own business here at that residence, and meeting and then being hired by Mary Todd Lincoln to be her personal modiste. And she ended up being her emotional support, frankly. So, all of that overview, and with the scene that they gave from Tony Kushner, I mean, look, literally you could just read, anybody could read the scene and you'd be a genius actor because the writing is so good. It comes down to that, right? The writing and the director. But for me as well, always in everything I do, where do I feel something when I read about this person, if they're a person who used to be on this planet or still lives? What do I feel? Is it affecting me in here? And if it does, and this did with Elizabeth right away, I went to the audition for the first time, I don't even know how long, and I never really, maybe it was the first time ever, I took a little bit of thread and a piece of cloth so that I could actually sew while doing the scene. I had the scene memorized because it was so good, it was easy to just remember. And a few days later, I got the call to go to Los Angeles to do one more audition. And then when I got the news that I got the part, I was at LAX, and a short while later, flying back to New York. And I remember everybody had boarded the plane and my phone was ringing, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's, hello? Everybody's boarded the plane. The people at the gate are like, you have to get on the plane now or we're going to leave without you. I'm like, bye, bye, bye. And I get the news. And I remember, we all have these moments in life where the kaleidoscope just shifts, and I just knew that something was going to be different from then on. Creative, I'm not talking about, I know I'm not saving the world or anything like that, but I just knew that this woman's story, this incredible woman, I had the honor to portray. In Steven Spielberg's film,
opposite Daniel Day-Lewis. That was a highlight of my life and of my career. That's happened twice so far. Maybe there'll be more. That definitely was one, and portraying Jeannie Boulet on ER was another. So, research begins. As much material as I can get. We could start filming in the fall of 2011. So, I read Jennifer's book. I read Elizabeth Keckly's autobiography. I read everything I can on the woman. I decide to schedule, oh good, yeah. to schedule, plan, and take a research road trip to go to the places, many places as I could in a short amount of time, to where Elizabeth lived. I didn't go to St. Louis, but I did go to Dinwiddie, Virginia, where she was born. I did go to Hillsborough, North Carolina, at the Burwell School, which is where she was with her half-brother when she was a slave to him and his wife. And the school was named after Burwell, and that's now a historical site. And then, of course, I actually went to where she's buried, where they believe that she's buried in Maryland, not that far away at the National Harmony Memorial Park Cemetery, and then, of course, here in D.C. And all over the place, all the research shows that 1017 12th Street Northwest, right? So I come to D.C., I have my camera, like my cell phone or whatever, I'm walking along 12th Street Northwest. And it's a very, obviously very contemporary, lots of corporate buildings and what have you. I'm like, oh, well, this is probably where it was. And I turn to my right, and the building is still standing. This like 4-story townhouse or brownstone or whatever, this townhouse that is surrounded by corporate offices, huge glass monoliths. And there is this 4-story building. What? So, take all these photos. The building is for sale. I call the realtor. I'm like, hi, my name's Gloria. I don't give my full name, of course. Hi, my name's Gloria. I'm doing a little bit of research on someone who used to live here. He gives me the code to enter the building. I don't know why I'm whispering it like it's some kind of... And I enter the building. And of course, nobody's there. There used to be a law office or what have you. I take all these photos. It's quite disrepair. You can see actually the original brick in some of the rooms. I'm not kidding. I can see it as if I'm there right now. I walked through a couple of these rooms, and I that's where Elizabeth lived and worked, in that building. I call up Rebecca Miller. Now, how about this? So Daniel Day-Lewis is married to the playwright Arthur Miller's daughter. And her name is Rebecca. So Daniel Day-Lewis's wife happens to have the same name as this Rebecca Miller. I'm like, okay, all right, got it, bring it. So, through your extraordinary work and support, and that building is now a part of the African American Heritage Trail. And there are some other exciting things going on with the building. The new owner of the building is a big supporter of Elizabeth Kecklys, and I'm sure, but I'll leave that for you to talk more about. I don't want to take up everything. So, all right. Yes, they are, to see all of us. So we start filming in Richmond, Virginia, and a couple of the clips that you're going to see, one in particular was filmed at the State Capitol building in Richmond, Virginia, which, as you know, used to be the capital of the Confederacy. So we are filming in the movie, we are filming the passing of the 13th Amendment in the state capitol in Richmond, Virginia, where at that time still a statue of Robert E. Lee was in the rotunda, 150 years after the beginning of the Civil War. I mean, come on. Like, there's some other forces happening at play here. I can't even, if you watch, or when you watch the movie again, and you watch that scene of the passing of the 13th Amendment, all the emotion on my face is just because of where we were, what we were doing, when we were doing it. It was the most profound, personal, and obviously quite the spiritual experience. It was incredible. So I'm hoping that we have those clips available to show now. And if that is the case, I would love for you to take a look, and then I'll say a few words afterwards. Thank you. So the first scene was literally on the first day of filming. And I remember Stephen, apparently this is a tradition of his, I'm sure I'm not talking out of school, where the first day of at least it was on this set, he gathered everyone, cast and crew and everything, to everyone to just kind of say a few words. And I remember walking onto the set, which was for the White House, and literally just happened to walk in the door and just turning to right where Stephen was, and then to his right was Daniel, and who was, of course, in full costume, and it's the first time I had met him. And I looked at him, and I think I must have gasped, because he was transformed. So we did that scene, and, you know, for the first couple of takes, I was just, right? And
when Elizabeth asks him, did you tell her a dream? You know, because he used to do that. Apparently, President Lincoln would share with his wife, of course, these traumatic dreams that he would have, kind of pretending his death, or these, you know, very disturbing images, and she would get all flustered. And Elizabeth Keckley ended up being very much so Mary Lincoln's emotional support for a number of different reasons. But that's why I wish that I was able to have read Tony Krishna's 500-page script. Of course, I would have made a 5-hour movie. That's why, you know, it wasn't more details about Elizabeth. The second scene was the last day of filming for me. And that was in the portico in Richmond, Virginia. They built the overhang. And that's where Elizabeth mentions her son George, who fought for the Union, because he could pass as white, her son George. So before the Emancipation Proclamation, he enlisted as a white man to fight for the Union. And he died in his first battle and was buried in a mass grave. And Elizabeth could never had a chance to say goodbye. So that, what else must I be? That's where that comes from. Masterpiece. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope you enjoyed the rest of the presentation. I hope I didn't talk for too long, but really, and I know there'll be a Q&A later, so I'll pass it back to you, Rebecca Miller. Not Daniel's wife, but you know, you understand.
Thank you, Gloria. I apologize. I know these masks, I guess we get to take them off Tuesday, huh? Yes. So now I'd like to introduce our friends from the White House Historical Association. They are going to show you a story map. So we have Sarah and Lina, and they'll be showing you a story map of Elizabeth's time here in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria. It's difficult to follow. Such an amazing talk. Yes. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us. My name is Lina Mann, and this is my colleague, Sarah Fling, and we are both historians on staff at the White House Historical Association. Just to give you a little bit of background about who we are, the association is a private, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization founded by First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy in 1961. And our mission is to preserve and interpret the rich history of the White House for the public. And as part of that mission, myself and my colleagues have been very involved in an initiative that we launched in February of 2020 called Slavery in the President's Neighborhood. The initiative seeks to tell the stories of enslaved and free African Americans who built, lived, and worked at the White House, as well as in surrounding homes in the Washington, D.C. area. And we know that, of course, obviously there's few written accounts of enslaved people's experiences, but we also know that their voices can be found in things like letters, newspapers, memoirs, census records, architecture, and oral histories. And so we have worked very hard to return these individuals to the historical forefront and intertwine their stories with the stories of presidents, first ladies, and first families. And Elizabeth Keckly is definitely part of that research. She comes to Washington, D.C. as a free woman, but she interacts with the enslaved community in Washington, D.C., and later with the free community in Washington, D.C. And so we wanted to talk about her today and her experience living within the president's neighborhood.
So if we could pull up the story map. Lina and myself are public historians by training, which means that we're always looking for new ways to make history more accessible and engaging for the public. And so as a result, we decided to create a story map as a resource for individuals who are interested in learning more about Elizabeth Kecklys' life. This story map is an online digital resource, it's free, that presents information about the different locations where Elizabeth Keckly lived, worked, and visited in the DC area, creating sort of a composite sketch of what her life would have looked like here in Washington. So as you can see, this is the opening slide, and we're gonna move chronologically through her time in DC, going back and forth on some of the stops that we've included. So we'll turn it over to Lina, and we're going to share exactly what's in the map with you all today.
Sure. So if we could go to our first slide here. So after growing up in, if we could go one more, that'd be great. Awesome. So after growing up in slavery and gaining her freedom, Elizabeth Keckly, of course, successfully purchases freedom for herself and her son George in 1855. After gaining her freedom, she continues to work as a seamstress in St. Louis for a few years, but in 1860, she then comes to Washington, D.C., and then she begins to establish a new business. And pretty quickly, she begins sewing for a lot of the elite women of Washington, D.C. If we could go to our next slide.
So one of the interesting ways that we did this research was by pooling from documentation in Elizabeth Kecklys' own memoir of places that she mentions visiting, as well as using things like directories and Washington, D.C. census data to really place these locations on a physical map. So, for example, Keckly mentions in her memoir that in 1861, she goes up to Harper and Mitchell, which is a dry goods store originally located on Capitol Hill, at 312 Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast, to shop for laces and trimmings, which she uses to create a dress for Robert E. Lee's wife, Mary. And in looking into this location of Harper and Lee, it's really interesting to learn more about the DC shopping community, that people are going up to Capitol Hill to buy things like embroidery and laces, and Elizabeth Keckly is one of those individuals. And we get that information right from her memoir. We can go to the next slide.
So one of Keckly's earliest clients in Washington, D.C. is Verena Davis. She is the wife of Mississippi Senator Jefferson Davis. And according to her memoir, the women discuss the looming Civil War, and Verena Davis actually does invite Keckly, according to her memoir, to accompany her to the South. Elizabeth does consider this offer, but eventually refuses, and in her memoir she states, quote, "A show of war with the South, I felt, would lead to actual war in the North, and with the two sections bitterly arrayed against each other, I preferred to cast my lot among the people of the North." So Verena Davis, of course, then goes on to become the First Lady of the Confederacy when her husband is elected its president. But of course, Elizabeth Keckly then goes on to become the modiste for the First Lady of the Union. So if we could go to the next slide. So in early 1861, one of Elizabeth Keckly's patrons recommends her services to incoming First Lady Mary Lincoln. She is instructed to meet with Mrs. Lincoln at the Willard Hotel on Sunday, March 3rd of 1861. However, Keckly actually waited until the following day, which was Inauguration Day, to meet Mrs. Lincoln. So she arrives at the Willard Hotel amidst this hustle and bustle of inauguration activities. Mrs. Lincoln then invites her to call at the White House again the following morning at 8 a.m. So Keckly arrives at the White House. She discovers 3 other dressmakers waiting to interview with the First Lady. And then after talking about Keckly's work and the pricing, Mrs. Lincoln did consent to hire her, and she stated, quote, "I cannot afford to be extravagant. We are from the West and we are poor. If you do not charge too much, I shall be able to give you all of my work." So then Keckly continues to sew for First Lady Mary Lincoln throughout her time in the White House. Next slide. And in her role as Mrs. Lincoln's seamstress, Elizabeth has this very unique view of the White House as the Civil War is progressing, and she writes about all of this in her memoir. She interacts with the Lincolns closely and divulges various details of their wartime life in this memoir. For example, when 11-year-old Willie Lincoln passes away from typhoid fever in the White House on February 20th of 1862, Keckly is present, and she writes, quote, "I assisted in washing him and dressing him, and then laid him on the bed. When Mr. Lincoln came in, I never saw a man so bowed with grief." Willie's death actually ends up bonding the two, Mary Lincoln with Elizabeth Keckley even more. As mentioned by Gloria, her son dies in an early skirmish of the Civil War, and so the women, I think, end up really bonding over the loss of their sons. Yes, and we can go to the next slide.
Go ahead to the next one.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, as important as Elizabeth Keckley is to this political scene, this social scene in Washington, D.C. through her connections to the White House, she's also very involved in free and enslaved Black communities here in Washington. And perhaps one of the most prominent of the causes that she supports is the Contraband Relief Organization, which she's an important founder of. Now, to give you a little bit of background, if you're unfamiliar with the idea of contraband camps in Washington, D.C., it's a bit complicated, but essentially, as Washington, D.C. makes slavery illegal in 1862, you see an influx of refugees, of enslaved individuals seeking freedom who are in the Confederate territories, coming to Washington in search of their own freedom. Now, in 1861, Congress passes the First Confiscation Act, essentially saying that the Union can, in any time of war, including the Civil War, capture enemy property. And as enslaved individuals are considered property by the Confederacy, these enslaved refugees are then considered contrabands, confiscated by the Union Army and allowed to live here in freedom. However, the living environment for these refugees who are coming in large numbers is very difficult. You're seeing camps pop up around the city with poor sanitary conditions, hunger, and a lot of these individuals fled with just the clothes on their back. And so Elizabeth Keckley forms the Contraband Relief Association in order to raise money to help these individuals. And she actually asked the Lincolns if they'll contribute to this cause. We know that Mary Lincoln writes to President Lincoln asking for $200, which is a lot of money at the time, to contribute to the contraband camps. And he does. We also know that one of these camps, for example, is the Freedmen's Village in Arlington, Virginia. It's really interesting because this is the confiscated estate of Robert E. Lee, and the poignancy of the location of this camp is not lost on the enslaved residents there, actually occupying in a semi-permanent village the land once held by Confederate General Robert E. Lee. We know that Elizabeth Keckley visited several of these camps, but we chose to include the Freedmen's Village because she writes about it in her memoir. And it's interesting, too, because these contraband camps end up being communities that grow into neighborhoods of African Americans in Washington that still exist to this day. We'll go to the next slide. We also included the White House again to show one of the dresses that is currently in the collection at the National Museum of American History. If you visit, you can probably see it. It's often on display. It's believed that this beautiful purple velvet dress with white piping and mother-of-pearl buttons down the front was created by Elizabeth Keckley for Mary Lincoln during the social season of winter 1861 to 1862. Now, if we go to the next. As we move through the timeline here, we're approaching some of these really difficult periods in American history. But first, you see the inauguration of President Lincoln on March 4th, 1865 at the Capitol building, which Elizabeth Keckley writes in her memoirs as a very memorable day in history. 2 days later, Lincoln holds his first public reception of his second term, and Keckley had a really interesting request on that day. She asked if Mary Lincoln could give her the glove that Lincoln wore to shake hands with the thousands of visitors that came to the White House, and Mary Lincoln does give it to her, and Keckley comments on the fact that this glove is dirty, that he had shaken hands with thousands of people, but that to her it was a really important relic of Lincoln's time at the White House. There's also a great story that comes out of this second inauguration related to Frederick Douglass, another really important individual, an abolitionist who interfaced with Elizabeth Keckley many times throughout their shared time in Washington, D.C. He tried to attend this public White House reception, but was barred from entrance by white doorkeepers at the White House. He eventually did negotiate his way in and was welcomed by Lincoln in the East Room. At this time, the two of them had very good rapport, and Lincoln was very happy to see him there. But rightfully so, Douglass was upset by this episode of being banned from entering the White House East Room and relayed it to Keckley, who then includes it in her memoir. If we go to the next slide, if you're familiar with the timeline, you know we are swiftly approaching the end of Lincoln's life. Although Elizabeth Keckley was not present at Ford's Theater when Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth while watching a play with Mary Lincoln, we do know that she was given several relics from that evening by Mary Lincoln, including the bonnet that you see here and a blood-stained cloak that Mary Lincoln wore that evening. Elizabeth Keckley deemed those pieces too sacred to sell. Instead, she donates them to Wilberforce University, where her son had attended and where she later taught sewing, using those proceeds to go toward a historically black university in Ohio.
All right, next slide. All right, so in the 1860s, Elizabeth Keckley lived and sewed in rooms located at this address. It's a little bit different in modern times, but 1017 12th Street Northwest. And on the morning of April 15th, 1865, following Abraham Lincoln's assassination, a messenger visited Keckley at this home and takes her immediately to the White House, where she is asked to console Mary Lincoln. Later, according to her memoir, Keckley learns that the First Lady when asked who Mary Lincoln would like to have by her side in her grief, she responded, quote, "Yes, send for Elizabeth Keckley. I want her just as soon as she can be brought here." So that, to me, demonstrates this very strong bond that these two women have over time, at least from Mary Lincoln's point of view.
If we go to the next slide, something that we found throughout our research in looking at city directories and census data from the 19th century is that while Keckley is in Washington after the Lincoln administration, she moves around to several addresses and works and lives in several neighborhoods in Washington. We've chosen to include one of these, which was on F Street. It's actually just around the corner from Ford's Theater, interestingly. And there's a great story in the Washington Republic about a reporter just strolling down the street and realizing that he sees a sign denoting that Mrs. E. Keckley lived there. And he actually goes upstairs and interviews her, and we have a great newspaper excerpt from that interview that the DCPL shared with us. But she also lives and works at several other locations throughout Washington, D.C., so she's scattered around the city, making a life for herself in many places.
All right, next slide. All right, so following the publication of her memoir, she publishes that in 1868, she is actually attacked for publishing various details about the elite women of Washington, including the personal correspondence that she publishes with Mary Lincoln. So she does, as a result, lose a little bit of credibility. Mrs. Lincoln refused to speak Keckley's name personally for the rest of her life, and Keckley ended up losing a lot of clients as well. But she continues, she keeps sewing. In 1892, she accepts a position, as Sarah mentioned, as the head of Wilberforce University's Department of Sewing and Domestic Arts. And then she moves to Ohio for a brief time before she ends up returning to Washington after we believe she suffered a possible stroke. She spends her final years of life at the National Home for Destitute Colored Women and Children. The home was incorporated by Congress in 1863, and the National Association for the Relief of Destitute Colored Women and Children administered it. And this institution was partially founded based on funds that were raised by Keckley. So she ends up passing away in 1907 at the age of 89 at this location.
If we go to the next slide, alongside all of these examples of where Elizabeth Keckley lived and worked, we also have another example of the community that she was a part of. 15th Street Presbyterian Church was founded in 1841, and it was a really prominent church for free and enslaved Black individuals throughout the 19th century, and it continues to be an important church in Washington, D.C. to this day. We know that they held Contraband Relief Organization meetings and fundraisers there, and that a eulogy was given for Keckley after her death in 1907 at the church. They also had several other prominent attendees, including William Slade, who was a black White House worker, worked alongside Elizabeth Keckley, and went on to become the first African-American steward at the White House. If we go to the next slide, which is our final slide, and a really interesting and difficult piece of this history is the story of Columbian Harmony Cemetery. So after Keckley's death, she was interred at Columbian Harmony Cemetery up in Brentwood, and at the time, it was the largest African-American burial site in Washington, D.C. You see several really important members of the free black community buried at this cemetery. But in the 1960s, for the construction of a new Rhode Island Avenue metro stop, if any of you are familiar and you're from Washington, they actually disinterred all of the bodies on this site and moved them out to Landover, Maryland. However, the headstones of this cemetery, the original headstones, were sold or thrown away. Many of them were used, as you can see in this really poignant photograph, on the riverbanks of the Potomac River, and many still are there. Nonprofits and the governments of Maryland and Virginia have been working, especially very recently in the last 2 years, to locate these headstones, to match them to individuals who are interred out in Maryland, and resolve this horrible piece of American history. Unfortunately, Keckley's headstone is one of those that has not yet been located, but research is ongoing to try to return that piece of history.
All right, so that is our map of Elizabeth Keckley and her journey through Washington, D.C. And I hope if you'd like to learn more about Elizabeth Keckley or our project with Slavery in the President's Neighborhood, feel free to check us out at whitehousehistory.org or check out some of our future events. So Thank you all for having us today.
Thank you to you both. We'll have some time for question and answer after our next speaker, Jennifer Fleischner, who has joined us from New York to tell you about Elizabeth's history. And I think I already have one question, which was, how did you become interested in Elizabeth? So I hope you'll talk a little bit about that. So please welcome Jennifer Fleischner.
I want to warn you, Rebecca just told me I have all the time I need. I was ready to cut this in half, which I can do. So with a show of hands, no, I don't want to put you up to anything. I can't, it's amazing for me to be here with Gloria. I'm going to cry because, you know, when I wrote this biography of Elizabeth Keckley, and thank you, Rebecca, and thank you, 20 years ago. And I sold the book, couldn't believe, and I pitched it, and I had to pitch it as a book about the Lincolns. That was it. That was the entryway to publication. It was Keckley, Lizzie Keckley, who brought me to this book, not the Lincolns. And so, you know, what's changed since I wrote it, and somebody else has to write the next book, you know, on her. It's just there, you guys. Anybody want to do it? Because this is it. A lot has changed, a rising interest in the lives of black women. So I don't have to go to not that I don't love the Lincolns, I don't have to go to the Lincoln conferences to be asked to speak. That's changed a lot. And so events like this, frankly, bring me to tears. This has been my, a lifetime, talk about mission. So, but I want to give credit where credit is due, and that's to Keckley herself, because everything we know about her, the fact that we know about her, is because she wanted us to. She left us, I'm going to talk a lot about that memoir, you know, that extraordinary memoir behind the scenes. Read that. That's the thing to read. Writing it, I'm sure you can imagine, was an audacious act. I mean, for any black person in her era to write a book was an act of audacity and hope. That's sort of echoing for me. It's a phrase someone recently has been using. but how much more audacious for a black woman who'd been enslaved. And something else, Behind the Scenes is Misleading as a title. It wasn't her title. She wouldn't have made it up. The editor and the publisher would have made it up, and so too they spelled her name incorrectly, so you're going to be seeing, sometimes you'll see without the second E, Keckly. That's because of me. Because my moment was when I saw her signature on all these documents. And it took me a while to see there isn't that second C, which is how she's spelt on the cover of her book. So Behind the Scenes is misleading because she wasn't behind the scenes in the book. She puts herself right there. Talk about audacity, witness, actor, right at the heart of one of the momentous periods, right in American history, our history, the Civil War, the White House, the Lincolns' kids, their sons, all those politicians, the generals, their wives. You saw, even before the break, the Confederacy, the folks who were going to be at the head of that. She's there. Her owner in St. Louis, who was married to Anne Garland, who was one of the Burrell sisters, and therefore, as you kept pointing out well and nicely, her half-sister, Keckly's half-sister. That Mr. Garland was a lawyer in the Dred Scott case that, as you all know, went to the Supreme Court. He was on the side of, what's her name? The owner, Mrs. I think it's with an S. Somebody out there? I'm blocking on it. Anyway, talk about sort of finding yourself at the heart. And while she was enslaved by him, he was defending, he was on the opposite side of Dred Scott when Keckly was there with him. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through I have two things that have obsessed me since I first I read her memoir for a book I was writing before this book on women's slave narratives. And that's how I met Mrs. Keckly, through her memoir and writing the book I wrote. And that was 30 years ago. And from that time, I just was obsessed with her, and two things really got to me. Like, how did she get from there, from Dinwiddie County, born enslaved, to here, literally DC? And the second question, how, and this is what I want to talk about more maybe, because you all did a great job of the sort of biography stuff, background stuff. How did she escape erasure from history? How did she escape that? A history from which millions of enslaved men, women, and children, black men, women, and children were erased. How did she do it? Because you can't, when you go to do the research on the life of an enslaved person, you don't go and look for the birth certificate or the letters they wrote when they were enslaved. They're not there. They don't have archives, until recently, there's a movement. But when I started this, I had to find her in the property lists of the masters. I had to find her in the tax documents, when they, right? And I found her by mistake, or not by mistake, but thinking I couldn't. Keckly herself didn't know when she was born, okay? She did not know, and she did not know, like most enslaved people did not know. Frederick Douglass writes a lot about this on the opening page of his narrative, that he did not know, and that whole opening page is, I did not know. The white children knew, I did not know. She didn't know when she was born, and she didn't know that her biological father was Armistead Burrell, the man who enslaved her. Not that her mother told her later on. But her mother, there was no. And so I just figured, well, that was lost. That's gone. So I wasn't looking for that. What I was looking for were things to find out about the plantation, the farm on which she was enslaved, and I went to what you go to. There's something called a commonplace book, the Mistress's Commonplace book, where it was like a book where you would keep your recipes, your inventory of, how many hogs you put up for the winter, in the smokehouse, how many horses, and there are slave lists there and slave lists. I got this and I Xeroxed what I could without reading it because I was like you, I went to all the places. And I kept that in an envelope for a while because I thought, okay, I'm going to use it, I'm going to throw in some recipe, or, see what they were eating, into the book to make it vivid, And I'm flipping through, and there I found the birth list. In the handwriting of the mistress, it was a list that she had inherited from her mother-in-law. Down, down, down I go. I see the name of her aunt. I recognize the name because it's in the memoir. And then I get to the bottom, and if you buy my book, it's in the book. You see the picture. But it's also in the Virginia Historical Society, which is where you really want to go to see it, because then you can see it. Down, down at the bottom, Lizzie, daughter of Aggie, February 1818. As close as we get, no date, no 10th or whatever. And I you couldn't believe what, I couldn't believe it because I didn't know it was going to be something I could find. And for most people, most of the enslaved, you don't find that. That doesn't even exist. A couple of things I want to add just to the, Gloria said, and I've repeated, her biological father was Armistead Burwell. But she thought of, she had a father who was enslaved by a neighbor, the man she thought of as her father. And she wrote he was her father, even after she knew he wasn't. And his name was George Hobbs. And when she was around 7, George Hobbs' master moved to Tennessee, taking him with him, forcing him, kidnapping him. And they never saw him again. Agnes and Lizzie never saw him again. But they exchanged letters into the 1930s. So therefore, so that we know her parents, I'm saying her father George, the man who fathered her until she was 7 and beyond, because he wrote letters. They were literate, right? And they wrote letters back and forth, and he wrote to Agnes. And I just want to, but he left notes. He sent notes to Lizzie, learn her book. He wanted her to learn her book, learn to read. And he said, I want Elizabeth to be a good girl and not to think that because I am bound so far that God's not able to open the way. I want to fill in another little moment that you talked about. The worst time of her enslavement was hands down when she was in Hillsborough, North Carolina, where I have spent quite a bit of time. And that's where she was on loan as a wedding gift to her half-brother and his wife. That's Robert Burwell. He was a minister. And the wife, Anna, who was, intellectual woman, founded a school in Burwell, the Hillsborough School, the Burwell School in Hillsborough, an historic site where Keckly's featured now. She was only 7 years older than Lizzie, okay? So don't imagine, think about that when Lizzie was loaned and she went into their household. And in Hillsborough, which is where they moved when she was 18, it was close enough to Dinwiddie County. She's separated from her mother. It's close enough to Dinwiddie that the White family the language that you can see used in the enslaved family. They talk about white family, our family, black and white. The white family would make visits back and forth. And Keckly, as would have been customary, asked Anna, could she go with her to see her mother? Anna refused. And Keckly's, here I want you to hear Keckly writing a letter to her mother in the 1830s. She says, or I'm sorry, I'm wrong. It's not a letter, it's what she talks about in her memoir, her reaction to that. She says, I have often wished that I lived where I knew I never could see you. Oh yeah, it is a letter to her mother, sorry, I'm really flustered. For then I would not have my hopes raised, and to be disappointed in this manner. I'd rather be so far away than to have this happen. Now, Lizzie felt that Anna was out to get her, that Anna was determined to break her pride, and the notion of breaking in the slave was not unknown, right? It happened, and frequently adolescents needed breaking in. Another thing Douglas writes about. And the beatings. Now, Anna didn't go to her husband, the minister, the half-brother. He was reluctant. He was reluctant in that way about the role, what would have been permitted to him. So she went to a neighbor who was also the head of a school, but he was actually known for beating the boys, so he had practice. And he did it, and it lasted, the sort of breaking in, lasted for 2 weeks until Lizzie, she did resist and confronted Anna and Robert, and they stopped. And they asked her to forgive them. They stopped. She stopped them. She's 18. And I wanted to just say a couple of things, that for 2 weeks, in a small town like Hillsborough was, 2 weeks of a beating would not have gone unnoticed in the town. And frequently in a small town, it could act as a gossip, could act as a check on brutality. I don't know, maybe there was a check. Keckly was the one who checked it, as far as I could tell. But I would also observe that when Keckly writes about it, it's there in Hillsborough that she uses the language, she's persecuted. She has a persecutor. And he was the son, Alexander Kirkland, a member of Burwell's church. He was the man who, for 4 years, she says, persecuted her, sexual assault, a sexual persecution. And that went on for 4 years, and whatever gossip was going on in their neighborhood, the only thing that stopped that was her giving birth to this white-looking child who would grow up and be able to pass. That was the thing that got her sent away, back home, fortunately, back to Virginia, back to where her mother was, the birth of the child. So, when she's back in Virginia, that's where she goes to be enslaved that she's passed around the family. That's the Garland family, the sister, the half-sister, her half-sister, whom she visits after emancipation. She goes back to visit her. And that is the family that moves to St. Louis. Now, one of the features of the Burwell family, and actually Anna, who married in, complains about it, is like they don't know how to manage money. So they're always broke, or they're always like needing money, basically. Which I guess gives her a little practice, because Mary Lincoln spent a lot of her time after Lincoln's assassination trying to pay off her debts, right? Needing money. Keckly stepped in for that. So when she was in St. Louis, and I think it was mentioned that her sewing business, but I want to say something, it wasn't exactly, she was hired out. She was hired out. She was still enslaved, so she doesn't get to keep the money. However, the value of that business to her was amazing because it was realized in the network of white women that she created, the women who really admired her, respected her, which mattered a lot to her, and loaned her the money to buy herself and her son out of slavery. For the sum of $1,200, which was a huge amount of money. So it was that network, it was the business, and knowing how to use the network. And that network is the network that actually got her first jobs in DC, too, when she came here. That was the network that got her to the White House. It got her to those, about to become Confederate, Lee's and what's her name, Verena Davis. Okay. It's also in St. Louis that she marries Kecklys, James Kecklys. That's where that name comes from. It's her married name. And she leaves him behind when she comes to D.C. Turns out he wasn't much help to her. He was a drunk, he was dissipated, and more than that, he had represented himself as being a free man, and he was in fact enslaved. So it also that in itself tells you a little bit about the sort of fluidity of, I think, and I remember Mrs. Trollope, I think, coming to St. Louis in some memoir, and she said she couldn't tell who was enslaved. There was a large free black population, and also, again, think about Kecklys hiring herself out as an enslaved person while she's enslaved. She's walking around. There's a sort of autonomy that she has also, and I think that's really important to have in your mind, to understand, like how she got from there to here. She's having a certain autonomy. So I only want to read to you when she gets to DC, and she's so recognizable that, and this is a little later than when she arrives, but I love this quote. It's from an article that was written about free blacks in DC in 1862, and it was written there, it was published and written to support emancipation in the district, DC, okay? Slavery was abolished in 1862. So this is an article meant to promote that by showing upstanding free black people. And so here's this line about Kecklys, describing her interactions with the white women she's sewing for, including, by this time, Mary Lincoln. Stately carriages stand before her door, whose haughty owners sit before Lizzie, docile as lambs, while she tells them what to wear. I just love that. Okay. All right. Let me talk about her memoir, because that's one thing that could use some more talk about, I suppose. Its original title was long, of course, and titles could be very long in the early. But you'll hear it's intended to sell books. Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House by Elizabeth Kecklys, formerly a slave, but more recently modiste and friend to Mrs. Abraham Lincoln. Okay, there's the pitch. All right, a couple of things I want to put out there. This is the era of Reconstruction, and you alluded to that as well. So that means it's after the abolition of slavery, and therefore, and there are a few other things I want to touch on later. Unlike earlier slave narratives, it was a whole genre of these from the 18th century on, her memoir wasn't going to be aimed at the abolition of slavery. Sort of before the war, that was one of the points of these memoirs. But after, and she's early in the after genre, right? She's at the start of what are these going to look like? Her memoir is aimed at expanding freedom. by proving her right, her natural right to be free. So while her biological father, her enslaver, might taunt her, as he did, that she would never be worth her salt, that was a quote, apparently he liked to say that to her, she would prove otherwise. She would become the seamstress, unjustly enslaved, and I'm putting seamstress first because that's who she was, and then unjustly enslaved to that's the subordinate identity, that to me, who supported her bankrupt master's impoverished family. She would become the woman unjustly enslaved who bought her own and her own son's freedom. And then she would use that freedom to move. And I mean move. I mean it metaphorically, I mean it literally. She would use her freedom to profit from the circulation of her work. And I'm quoting from another scholar, and to move through any space she pleased. Move where she wanted, how she wanted, when she wanted. Yeah, I'm gonna have to blow my nose. I'm a mess. All right. Kecklys wrote her narrative between October 1867 and April 1868, right? And she wrote it when she was in a boarding house in New York City, where she stayed while she was managing the auction of Mary Lincoln's jewelry and clothes 2 years after the assassination. This was Mary Lincoln's latest in a series of schemes, unsuccessful, all of them, to raise money for herself after Lincoln's death and fight over the pension in order to settle her debts, okay? This was called in the newspaper, the old clothes scandal. Tells you everything you need to know and how it was viewed then. And it failed spectacularly. Mary, who by then was living in Chicago, and had summoned Kecklys to do this. They were not together. You know, Lizzie was back here. She had a big business. So Mary expected Kecklys to devote herself to her business, to drop her own in DC and go to New York. And Kecklys mostly did just that. She talks about this sort of this bond they had, or she was a strange woman, Mary Lincoln was, she said, but had a sort of power. Now, Mary had promised to pay her, but did not pay her. Instead, Mary returned to Chicago, and she left Kecklys in New York City on the receiving end of a stream of letters which Mary wrote to her, complaining, directing, cajoling, scheming, and I want to give you a sense, vintage Mary Lincoln letter. Talk to the brokers, so there were brokers they were using, B and K, those were their initials. Talk to the brokers of the grateful feelings I express towards them. Do pet up, B, and see my things returned to me. So she's sort of giving Kecklys lines to flatter the brokers to get what she wants. And as always, Mary was monitoring the newspapers at the time for stories about her. The old clothes scandal was in the newspapers a lot. And she was frustrated and she was enraged by the character attacks against her. So she asked Kecklys, she wanted Kecklys not only to take care of the auction of the jewelry and clothing or to retrieve them, get them back, but she also wanted Kecklys to give interviews to the editors, and Kecklys did that. And you would see, if you look, the newspapers wrote approvingly of Lizzie with a little catch. Here's the statement of approval. The faithful Negro servant, Lizzie. I'm sure I don't have to tell you what's wrong with that. All right, but approval. Staying in New York City, and you said this, it lost her clients, depleted her finances. Mary Lincoln had promised a commission if she couldn't pay her salary, but because nothing sold, no commission was forthcoming. And Keckly writes in her memoir that she was wretchedly, quote, low-spirited and desperate for money. Mary suggested Keckly get a job, an extra job in New York, sewing. But then she also suggested that Keckly might come to Chicago and share her fortunes. That's Lizzie, for a year or more, share her fortunes with her. So through the fall of 1867, a little over 2 years after the assassination, Lizzie was in New York City sewing. She was handling the business, and she began writing her book. That's what she began to do on the side. And she knew she was taking a risk. And the risk, of course, would be she's going to be writing this book featuring the doings of powerful white people in D.C. And she writes in her preface, I also love this, "It may be charged that I have written too freely on some questions, especially in regard to Mrs. Lincoln. I do not think so." No, I do not think I wrote too freely. I wrote as a free woman. But Lizzie didn't expect, or maybe couldn't expect, the ferocity of the blowback that she received. And here's some of the blowback. Excuse me. It's again important to sort of think again about the time. This book, 1868, it's published, comes out during an era of enormous expansion of democracy, right? The 13th and 14th Amendments, abolition of slavery, but also, or maybe more than talking about another way of expanding, the 14th Amendment, guarantee of equal protection of the laws extended to free black people. And these were ratified in 1865, abolition in 1868, okay? Her book comes out. At the same time, those amendments, you see already, pretty quickly a really ferocious reaction to that expansion of democracy. I'm sure you know this, particularly from the South, from white Southerners and their supporters pushing back against the national vision of that expansion. Well, similarly, in the case of Keckly's narrative, it took no time for those northern newspapers who were writing favorably about her, the faithful Negro servant, Lizzie, to dub her the angry Negro servant, and one of those treacherous creatures who, unleashed by freedom, a danger to American society. And here's part of one review. This is from the Washington National Intelligencer that refers to the Keckly woman as a symbol of all that threatened the, quote, peace and happiness of white family life. And here it goes. If the Negro servant in one conspicuous home may be tolerated in spreading to the world her representation of all the most secret and unguarded words that are uttered in the bosom of such a family, what family of eminence that employs a Negro is safe from such desecration? When will it end? And then another reviewer writes, this is about the dangers, this proves the dangers of educating the black and Irish working class, especially girls. Now here's this. The theories about the diffusion of knowledge and the education of the masses are all very fine and within certain limits work well. But when Bridget and Dinah take to writing books instead of doing their work and selects for themes the conversations and events that occur in the privacy of the family circle, we respectfully submit that it is carrying the thing a little too far. And they went on to argue against mass education. You know, she was called grossly shameless and indecent. The book was an atrocious invasion of privacy, like listening at keyholes, opening letters. More crudely, someone produced an anonymous and viciously racist and sexist parody, supposedly written by an illiterate black servant who could only sign her name with an X. So stunned, Lizzie was stunned, and she responded in print. And what she did was she challenged the hypocrisy of newspapers that had published a bitter crusade against Mrs. Lincoln. Now they had flipped. They were defending Mrs. Lincoln. They had flipped. And in her defense, she writes, is my offense actually that my skin is dark and that I was once a slave? May I not be permitted to express now and then an opinion becoming a free woman? I'm going to end there.
So if I could have all our speakers come up and sit up here for a moment, we're going to have some time for Q&A, if anybody has any questions for our speakers. So do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I have a question, really for any of the speakers. Do you have a sense of what brought her to D.C., or did you get the sense that it was more kind of a symbolic move because she could?
You know, look at me. Yeah, she actually went to Baltimore first. Oh. She went to Baltimore first, and I don't know why she didn't stay there, but she does write in her memoir, I always wanted to work for the women of the White House. Mary also claims to have always wanted to marry the guy who would work in the White House.
So do I. Not currently, I'm just saying. No offense. Oh my God. I have to stop. I think, I didn't know that she went to Maryland first, but that whole desire to want to work for, go to Washington, D.C., I mean, it seems from what I gather, it's like she always had this, like to move from St. Louis all the way back to the Northeast is a huge, like she was very kind of, I don't know, maybe I'm projecting, like she had this drive in a way, like she wants to do more, she can do more, I'm gonna buy my own freedom, even though, she had to, it was her clients that raised the money for her, but she didn't give up. My son's going to Wilberforce, her son's going to Wilberforce University, I'm gonna move, I'm going to create, I wanna work for the most upper level, upper class, whatever, white women, because that's exactly what, that's damn straight. I don't know if she would curse. She probably did do it. Yeah, she did pay the women back. The ones who wanted their money back, that raised the money for her to buy her own, she paid them all back.
I would also add that when she does go to Baltimore, I believe, so she tries it for like a month or so. She says she's teaching classes, trying to get her business started. It seems like maybe her business didn't take off enough when she arrived in Baltimore, so then she moved over to D.C. That's sort of how I've interpreted a little bit.
Yes, sir.
So a question for Jennifer. How common was it for slave women to become proficient seamstresses?
Very common. It's a good question. Very common. Sorry, is this on? No. You can see I'm not, I don't know well, whatever. Very common because they were the ones who made the clothes. So up for the white family and then also for their own. So they sewed a lot. In fact, and Lizzie's mother was the one who sewed, she says, all the clothes for the Burwell family. So to be a seamstress was a job. If you weren't in the field or you weren't in the kitchen, this was one of the mean form of labor. Yeah. But Not everybody became the modiste that she did. That was a special, you probably all know this better than I, but very highly specialized with tight stitching and.
What is a modiste?
Yeah, they'll tell you.
So not only was Keckly sewing these dresses, she's taking part in the designing, the actual fashion of the dresses themselves, which shows that, I mean, this is a skill you can acquire when you're working for wealthy white women, but in Washington especially, that means that she's very skilled in understanding what's in style, what's trending. Do you want to add to that, Gloria?
I don't mean to cut you off. Also, in addition to that, that quote that you mentioned, the carriages pull up and they are docile as lambs in front of her. She knew what she was doing. And also, because of her being beaten when she was 5 years old, like she lost her she grew up, she learned fast how to be a good black girl. And, so she was not, and her own natural presence, where there was a lot of grace. She was graceful and she was respectful, and she looked amazing herself because she wore her own designs, do you know? And so, yeah, they would be docile as lambs because she made them look better and also made them feel good about themselves that they are hiring this. It's all complicated. It's great. Did you want to continue? No? Okay.
Well, and they also, at the 12th Street residence, there's articles about how women of Washington would gather outside of the boarding house where Lizzie lived on 12th Street, and when they would expect Mary Todd Lincoln to show up there at times as well. So yes, sir, in the back. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. I just.
So I guess this is more of a question directed towards the second presenters, which is that just out of curiosity of the, I guess, intimate relationship between Mrs. Keckly and Mrs. Lincoln. Historically, black women, especially domestic black servants, have known to play a role in white families, which is easily summed up in the term mammy, as a sort of women who are supposed to care about white children who are not their own more than their own children, and have a very large love for the white family. So I was wondering, and that sort of led to a lot of dependency on especially black domestic servants and black women in general, to be everything for families that aren't even their own. So I was wondering, in the relationship between Mrs. Keckly and Mrs. Lincoln, was there a codependency? I know they bonded over the loss of their sons, but would you say that there was sort of a larger contribution from Mrs. Keckly herself?
Yeah, I would say that I always think about the power in that relationship between Elizabeth Keckly and Mary Lincoln. Yes, we do describe that they've developed a friendship over time, but as she's describing all of these things in her memoir, I always have to think, yes, she is serving the President of the United States, she's serving the First Lady of the United States, and I think that you're right in a sense. She definitely does write about the children of the Lincolns. She's definitely involved with that family, and so she does take on that sort of role. And I will also mention, not Elizabeth Keckly focused, but the White House in general really relies on the labor of enslaved individuals and other free black individuals throughout the entirety of its history, from the beginning of the White House to now. There's a lot of labor that goes into the White House that has been black individuals.
I would also add that Mary Lincoln is born into a slave-owning family in Kentucky. There is evidence of a sort of mammy figure in Mary Lincoln's early life, that her family owned an enslaved woman who took care of her family. And so I would say that idea of dependency on a black woman is something that she's born into, that she's experienced in a different way, that may have later influenced how she's working with someone like Keckly.
For sure. And I just want to say, based, especially because of what you've written in your extraordinary book, just FYI, I've optioned the book. You know that, right? I'm just kidding. No. No. I've optioned the book to tell the unique story of Mrs. Keckly and Mrs. Lincoln because of the detail, the intricate the stories, the details that you write in your book were unbeknownst to me until, but it's no question being raised in the South, and of course, but yet at the same time, they were very similar. Like, these were women of pretty much very close in age. Like, it's not, Elizabeth was younger than Mary, the exact same age. So there's that as well, it's like, and Elizabeth was very into, like, there were just so many parallels as adult women of the same age that I think might kind of go beyond just the historical aspect for Mary Lincoln.
I just want to say, that was such a great question. Are you a student? Oh my God, brilliant.
Great question.
That was a fabulous question. Fabulous question. Give me a hand. All right, that's all I have to say.
And
But
Howard,
I do write a lot about that in the book, and codependency. Mary very, very, very much relied on Keckly emotionally in the White House, especially after her son died. Their son, Willie, died when he was 12 in 1862. And even Lincoln asked, he was asking for help from Lizzie, from some of her, a cousin, a half-sister. And so that was recognized, the role she served in that.
And Howard, you had a question?
Oh, yeah, I was just curious how much is known about the actual conduct of her business. Assumedly, she had other people working for her because she couldn't do it all herself. And I don't know to what extent that information is available.
So I had a family approach me last spring, and they believe that their ancestor worked with Elizabeth Keckly. That is sort of their family lore. So she is, we know that their husband worked in the White House at some point or in some capacity, and this family believes that the wife of this person was working with Elizabeth Keckly sewing. Unfortunately, I have not been able to verify that yet, and I find any supporting documentation, but I do think that there were other people involved with her business, and I'd love to know more about them. So that's sort of a curiosity thing for me that I'm still looking for more information about. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I have a few questions. One, are there markers on those sites that you all talk about, the White House, on the buildings and the locations? The other question is, who paid for her headstone that is now at the bottom of the river? And was there an obituary written about her when she passed away?
Sorry. Headstone question you take. I'll just take the who paid for it. She had a will. She had money. She didn't have much, so I think it came out of her money. And what was
meaning the new plaque?
the plaque? I'm going to bring that. And what was the other part? Obituary.
Yes.
She. That's also in the book. She had a wonderful. I don't know if there was an obituary, but there was, and maybe you guys know, but there was a wonderful eulogy that Francis K. Grimke, of the famous Grimke family, he delivered a eulogy, and I must have read that in a newspaper, so I guess, and at the 15th Street Church. And I quote at length from that in the book about her respect, how self-respect. There's also a book called They Knew Lincoln, which are filled with interviews with, it's sort of an oral history, an early oral history with those who worked at black people who worked in the White House and some of their children, and they remember Keckly, so there's sort of descriptions there. Yeah, I'll hand it over.
I was going to say that, so we'll talk about that in a minute, about how things are marked around DC. But I also wanted to say that I think there also was this concerted effort to sort of erase Elizabeth from history, because there's a certain point in the 20th century where a guy comes forward and basically says she was not a real person. and tries to bring that out in the media, but, you know, these records do exist, and it was pretty easy to prove that she was a real person.
Was that
was
the
that-
30s or 40s?
No,
Yeah.
well, it was when Grimke was around and said, yeah, I knew her. She was real. So it was
Right,
early
okay,
enough.
yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Did the book sell? Did her memoir sell?
That's a really good question. It sold, but Robert, the son of Mary Lincoln, Mary was outraged and offended by it, and the story is tried to buy up every copy he could, and anyway, it sort of fell out of sight for a while. She did. The man who edited it. This was very common. This was how you got published. You had a white editor for you know, all the slave narratives, a lot of the books by black people at the time. So the editor who took it and helped her get it published, he also arranged speaking tours for like Mark Twain. I mean, he was a journalist, and so I think she might have done, you know, he was going to promote it, but again, it was the outrage with which it was met, and also disapproval by her peers, by other black, you know, middle class, right, who felt it put at risk their own, you know, reputations and jobs. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am, at the top.
There's another book about Elizabeth Keckley, written by another Jennifer. And actually, this question is mainly for Jennifer. And of course, the other book was written primarily for a young adult, even middle school audience. And it's considered historical fiction. I think your book is considered a biography. But my question is it total biography or is it also somewhat speculative?
Oh my God, it's 100% biography. When I can't find something, I say, I don't know, and it's got a lot of footnotes. And it took a lot of time to work on, yeah, as novels do too, actually.
Yes, I'm a Virginia native, and it's very obvious to me that Ms. Keckley has Native American ancestry. She was actually listed as Native American on the census, Native American white. Virginia, they tried to erase the Native American and classify a lot of them as black or colored. If you find any information about her ethnicity, she looks like a Virginia Indian. Or a mixed race.
Yeah. You know, all these questions, when we say we don't know, this is where the row of students there, you write the next books. Because there is so much work to be done.
Yeah, but write them after the movie comes out.
So then Gloria can buy those rights
That's
and
first,
you can do a
yeah.
part 2.
One other thing that came to my mind when you asked about her business, that came from somewhere, the question about her business and the sewing, and also what happened to her business afterwards. There's an historian in Hillsborough who's working on that very thing, the sewing business. So maybe she has stuff coming out.
Yes.
Good afternoon. I thank you again always for writing and sharing this amazing history. Many of us have known about Ms. Keckley for a while, but I want to ask, when you think about some of the locations where she resided, did it also include another DC address, 731 to 733 Newport Street, Northwest Washington, D.C.? This is a location that we, of course, are trying to make sure is preserved. And
Just a case of point, that was a building that was purchased by the Home for Destitute Women and Children in 1930. So it was after Mrs. Keckley died. So it's associated with her as one of the founders of that organization. And so we are working with a group of residents to preserve that property as part of that legacy.
And there is a plaque of her. I went to that property, and there is a plaque of Elizabeth out front. So, yeah, great.
And on the boards outside, you'll actually see where we highlight two of the properties, one being the original one that had been a mansion of a rich white man who actually then moved to the south. He then demanded his property back and swore his oath back to the Constitution, and eventually was pardoned and received his property back. And then the home actually built another property just north of Boundary Street, which is now Florida Avenue on 8th. So the Euclid property is not actually far from that one. Okay, oh, there was another question. Oh, one last question, yes. Oh, yes.
Hello, I want to first say thank you all so much for coming to speak. I've enjoyed every minute of this presentation. My question is for Gloria. You had mentioned that when you first got the script for Spielberg's film, that you immediately connected to Kecklys' story because it was so well written, and you also visited all the places that she had been to historically to really get a sense of who she was. So I was wondering, as an actress, were there any aspects of her character, once you really had a full sense of who she was as a person, that you personally connected to, that you could directly access once the camera started rolling?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And I just want to, I wish I could have gone to every place where Elizabeth lived, but I didn't. I went to the few places I mentioned. Many parts of her character I connected with in a very tangible, deep way. Again, her fortitude, her faith, her intelligence, her grace, her surviving trauma, and yet always moving forward, her entrepreneurism, her giving back to society, Contraband, home for destitute women and children. Her, but always the thing for me that resonates the most, I think all of those things are connected to just this faith. Even in that scene, God will see to it. That in itself was, to me, those few words were like the umbrella that just covered everything else about her. So, yeah.
You're welcome.
And our speakers will stick around for a few minutes after the program to also answer some questions upstairs, if you like. We're just going to finish up a few more things, so that way I know that we were planning to end at 1 for those of you who need to leave. I do apologize again for getting started a little late. We'll answer the question also about the plaque. And one of the things, maybe we can go to the next slide, Melissa. So I'd love for these women to come over and unveil this plaque. If you'd like to come over here. So initially when Gloria called me 11 years ago or so, wanted to find a way for this particular site, the building that you see, to be memorialized. It is not an individual landmark, although the owner of the building has committed to protecting the building. And she was very interested in a marker, and so I was speaking with our friend Patsy Fletcher, who's no longer with us, who was the outreach coordinator for the DC Historic Preservation Office, and she ran the African American Heritage Trail, so did some research and has added it to that trail as well. And so this is the plaque that will go up on the building, and you're welcome to take the, there you go, right there, yes. And so we're really excited to have this put up on the building shortly. It's hot off the presses. I actually just was delivered to my house yesterday. So we're really excited for that. And as we mentioned, there is a marker up at 1733 Euclid Street. DCPL is also, we can go to the next slide. We are adding information to our DC Historic Sites app as we go about Kecklys Life. We also are working on a tour that is about slavery in Washington that will be out shortly. But this particular app has about 1,000 entries of historic sites across DC, and there's a lot of tours about African American civil rights and the Civil War and things like that. So it should be of interest. You can click that barcode, and it's an app on your phone. It's free to download, or you can look at it on our website as well. It's what is known to be a big time suck. So with that, thank you all for coming. We have some great programs coming up. It's like I mentioned before, it's our 50th anniversary year. We'll be concluding the year with a major celebration on the roof deck on May 20th. And so we hope to see you all at a future event of DCPLs. And thank you all so much for coming and your patience earlier today. So have a great afternoon.